First Circle by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Chapter 83. The door, which had creaked when it was being locked, opened without a sound. The long-faced warder stepped through the narrow opening, and only when he was inside asked in a low, menacing voice, "Why did you knock?" Innocenti felt a weight lifted off his chest. If the warder ventured into the room, the air could not be poisoned. "I feel faint," he said haltingly. "Please give me some water." "Remember now," said the warder, "on no account must you knock. If you do, you will be punished." "But what if I'm ill? Or what if I have to call someone?" "You are not to raise your voice. If you need to call," he continued in the same gloomy, flat, impassive tone, "wait until the peephole opens and raise your finger in silence." He stepped back and locked the door. The machine started and stopped. The door opened. This time it creaked. Innocenti began to understand. They were trained to open the door with or without noise as it suited them. The warder handed him a mug of water. "Listen," said Innocenti, taking it. "I don't feel well. I need to lie down." "You're not supposed to in a box." "Where did you say? Where is one not supposed to?" He wanted to talk, if only to this stone statue, but the warder had already stepped back and was closing the door. "Listen to me. Call your chief. Why have I been arrested?" Innocenti remembered to say. The door closed and the key turned in the lock. He said box in English. So they cynically call these cupboards boxes. Well, they're not wrong. He drank a mouthful of water. He no longer felt thirsty. The mug, about the size of a teacup, had an odd picture on its green enamel. A cat in spectacles was pretending to read a book, but in fact watching a small bird which had hopped impudently near. It was unlikely that they had chosen the picture especially for Lubyanka, but how appropriate it was. The book was the law, and the cheeky sparrow was Innocenti yesterday. He actually smiled, and the wry smile brought home to him the full measure of what happened. And yet it also gave him a certain joy, the joy of this crumb of ordinary, everyday reality which had come to him. If anyone had told him in advance that he would smile within half an hour of being locked up in a Lubyanka cell, he would not have believed it. Stavronok in the next cell was having a worse time. Not even the cat would have amused him at that moment. He pushed his overcoat aside and managed to put the mug on the table as well. The lock grated. The door opened. A lieutenant with a paper in his hand came in. The warder's haggard face could be seen over his shoulder. Innocenti, the diplomat in his large grey tunic with the gold embroidery, rose casually. "Lieutenant, what's happened? What's this misunderstanding? Show me the warrant. I haven't read it." "Surname?" said the lieutenant. "Volodin." Innocenti gave in with good grace, as though anxious to get the formalities over and clear it up. "Name and patronymic?" "Innocenti Artemyevich." "Year of birth?" 1919. "Place of birth?" "Leningrad." Just then, when presumably the formalities were over and Innocenti was waiting for an explanation, the lieutenant stepped back and the door shut, nearly catching his toes. Innocenti sat down and closed his eyes. He was beginning to feel the power of the inhuman apparatus of prison. The machine started humming, and then it stopped. All sorts of major and minor matters came into his head. All had seemed so urgent an hour ago that even now he almost tried to get up to run and attend them. But there was no room in the box even to take a full pace, let alone run. The peephole was uncovered. Innocenti raised his finger. The woman with the sky-blue epaulettes and the dull, heavy face opened the door. "I need to," Innocenti made an expressive gesture. "Hands behind your back. Come along," she said, in a commanding voice. Innocenti went out into the corridor, which, after the stuffy cell, struck him as pleasantly cool. A short way down the passage, she nodded at a door. "There!" He went in, the door locked behind him. Apart from the hole in the floor, with two iron ledges for the feet, the wood and the walls were the floor and the walls were tiled red. Water gurgled refreshingly in the hole. Glad here at last to escape from the watching eye, Innocenti squatted. There came a click from the other side of the door. He raised his head and saw the same peephole with its cone-shaped opening and the eye watching him, no longer intermittently but continuously. Embarrassed, he stood up. The door opened before he had time to raise his finger. "Hands behind your back, come on," said the woman, unruffled. Back in the box, Innocenti, without thinking, pushed up his sleeve to see the time, but time had ceased to exist. He sighed and sat looking at the cat on the mug, but before he became absorbed in his thoughts, the door was unlocked. A big-faced, broad-shouldered man in a grey linen coat said, "Surname?" "I've already answered that," said Innocenti. With no change of tone, like a radio operator calling a station, the man repeated, "Surname?" "Well, Volodin, of course." "Pick up your things, come on," said Greycoat dispassionately. Innocenti picked up his coat and hat and went through the door. He was shown back to the room where he had first been. the one where they ripped off his epaulets and taken away his watch and his notebooks. "They've taken my things away, you know," he said. "Strip," said the warder. "Why?" Innocenty was taken aback. The warder met his eyes with a straight look. "Are you Russian?" "Yes." Usually so quick at repartee he couldn't think of one at the moment. "Strip." "You mean foreigners don't have to?" The warder waited in stony silence. With a shrug and attempt at a smile, Innocenty sat down on a stool, took his shoes off, removed his tunic and held it out to the warder. Although he attached no ritual importance to his uniform, he treated his gold-braided clothes with respect. "Throw it down." Innocenty hesitated. The warder tore the beige-grey tunic from his hands, flung it to the floor and snapped. "Naked." "What do you mean?" "Naked." "Well, that's quite impossible, comrade. It's too cold." "If you don't, you'll be undressed forcibly," the man warned him. Innocenty thought it over. They'd set upon him once before, and they were ready to do it again. Shivering with cold and disgust, he took off his trousers and his silk underclothes and dropped them in a heap on the floor. "Take your socks off." He took them off and stood barefoot on the floorboards. His feet and hairless legs, delicately white and soft, like the rest of his body. "Open your mouth. Wider. Say ah. Again. Say ah. Now raise your tongue." Like a horse dealer, his unwashed hands prodded inside Innocenty's mouth, stretching one cheek and then the other, pulling down the lower eyelids. The warder convinced himself that there was nothing hidden in the eyes or mouth, and tipped back the head so the nostrils were lit up. And then he checked both ears, pulling them back, told Innocenty to spread out his hands to show there was nothing between the fingers, and to swing his arms to show there was nothing under his armpits. In the same flat, irrefutable tone, he said, "Take your penis in your hands. Turn back the foreskin. More. Right, that's enough. Move your penis up and right, up and left. You can drop it. Turn your back to me. Straddle your legs. Wider. Bend down and touch the floor. Legs wider. Stretch your buttocks with your hands. Right, now squat. Quickly. Once more." Thinking about his arrest before it happened, Innocenty had pictured to himself a duel of wits to the death. For this he was ready, prepared for a high-principled defence of his life and his convictions. Never had he imagined anything so simple, so dull and irresistible as reality. The people who received him were petty-minded, low-grade officials, as uninterested in his personality as in what he had done, but alert and watchful in matters for which he was unprepared and which offered him no chance to resist. What indeed would resistance mean, and what good would it do him? Every time on a different pretext, concessions were required of him, so trifling compared to the battle ahead that there was no point in making a fuss. Yet taken as a whole, the systematic deviousness of the procedure effectively broke the prisoner's will. Putting up with every humiliation, Innocenty stood in dejected silence. The examiner nodded to him to go and sit in the stool near the door. The idea of his bare body touching this new cold surface was unbearable, yet Innocenty sat down, and soon found with pleasure that the wooden stool actually made him feel warmer. He had experienced many intense pleasures in his life, but this one was new. Pressing his arms to his side and his knees to his stomach, he felt warmer still. Meanwhile, the examiner turned over the piles of clothes, shook and prodded them, and held them up to the light. Showing a glimmer of humanity, he dealt with the underclothes first. After feeling inch by inch every seam and pleat of the pants and vest, he threw them over to Innocenty. He detached the socks from their suspenders, turned them inside out, and threw them across the door as well, so that now Innocenty was able to clothe his body and feel it revive in the warmth. Next, the warder took a large jackknife with a rough wooden handle, opened it and set about the shoes, scornfully chucking out the pieces of pencil. He peeled off the galoshes and with a concentrated air bent the soles sharply again and again to see if there was any hard object concealed inside them. Inserting his knife, he did in fact dig out a small strip of metal and put it on the table. Then he took an awl and pierced one heel with it. Watching him at work, Innocenty spared a thought for the poor man. How sick he must have been of going through people's underclothes, cutting up their shoes, and looking up their anuses year after year. But even this flicker of irony died down in him as he waited and watched in misery. After unpicking all the gold braid and cutting the buttons and button loops off the tunic, the warder tore the lining and searched carefully inside. He took quite as long over the seams and pleats of the trousers, while the winter overcoat gave him more trouble. Deep in the interlining, he must have thought he touched something other than cotton wool, a hidden letter, an address, some poison, for he prodded for a long time, with as grave an air of concern as if he were operating on a heart. The search must have taken at least an hour. Satisfied at last that the galoshes were made of nothing but rubber, they bent obediently this way and that. He threw them at Innocenty's feet and collected his trophies, braces and suspenders. He warned Innocenty that neither were allowed in prison. Tie, tie pin, cufflinks, the strip of metal from the shoe, the two halves of the pencil, the gold thread and insignia off the uniform, and a large number of buttons. Only now did Innocenty appreciate the full extent of the damage. Not the ruined shoes, not the torn lining or the wadding sticking out of the armholes of the coat, but the removal of nearly all his buttons, when he was also being deprived of his braces and suspenders, struck him for some time as the ultimate humiliation. "Why have you cut off the buttons?" he said. "Regulations." "How am I supposed to keep my clothes on?" "With bits of string." "What? This? String? What string? Where am I going to get it?" But the door closed and the key turned in the lock. Innocenty neither knocked on it nor shouted. He remembered that a few buttons had been left on the overcoat and he must be thankful for small mercies. He was learning fast. Holding up his trousers, he took a turn or two around the room, but scarcely had time to enjoy its spaciousness in the exercise when the key rattled once again and a different warder, also in a linen coat but white and rather grubby, came in. Looking at Innocenty as at a familiar object always to be found in the room, he said, "Take all your clothes off." Innocenty meant to answer in a stern voice, but all that came out of his constricted throat was a hurt squeak. "But I've just put them on. Couldn't somebody have told me?" Evidently, nobody could, for the warder merely looked at him with a blank bored face, waiting for the order to be carried out. What struck Innocenty most about the people he met here was their capacity for silence at moments when it would have been normal to reply. Already getting into the way of implicit, spineless obedience, he took off his clothes and shoes. "Sit down." The warder pointed to the stool. The naked prisoner sat down without asking himself why. Now that other people were doing the thinking for him, he was quickly losing the free man's habit of thinking before he acts. The warder gripped the back of his neck and pressed a pair of clippers roughly to his temple. "What are you doing?" Innocenty shuddered and made a weak attempt to free himself. "You have no right. I'm not under arrest yet." He meant that the charge had not yet been proven. Clutching his head as hard as ever, the barber continued to shave him in silence. Innocenty's flicker of resistance died down. The proud young diplomat, who had walked with such an independent air down the gangways of international airports and glanced with such vague blasé eyes at the busy daytime glitter of Europe's capitals around him, was now a drooping, raw-boned, naked man with a half-shaved head. His fine, light chestnut hair fell in soft curls like sad, silent flakes of snow. Catching a strand, he rubbed it between his fingers. He sensed that he loved himself and his departing life. He still remembered his deduction that meekness would be interpreted as guilt. He remembered his resolve to resist, object, argue, demand to see the prosecutor, but while his reason still held on to it, his will was being shackled by the pleasant numbness of a man freezing to death in the snow. Having shaved his head and ordered him to stand and raise each arm, the barber shaved his armpits, and he squatted on his heels and with the same clippers shaved his pubic hair. This tickled. Innocenty shivered. The barber snapped at him to keep still. "May I dress?" asked Innocenty when this procedure was over, but the barber left without a word and locked the door. This time he had the cunning not to hurry into his clothes. His shaved skin was unpleasantly prickly. Passing his hand over his head and finding it unfamiliar, it had never been clipped all over since childhood. He felt an odd short stubble and bumps that he didn't even know were there. After a while he got into his underclothes, but just as he was pulling on his trousers, the key rattled in the lock, and another warder with a fleshy purple nose came in holding a large card. "Surname?" "Volodin," the prisoner replied without arguing. "Name and patronymic?" "Innocenty Artemyevich." "Year of birth?" 1919. "Place of birth?" "Leningrad." "Take all your clothes off." Half dazed, he took off those he had on. His vest slipped off the table where they put it and fell to the floor, but this no longer disgusted him and he didn't bother to pick it up. The warder inspected him carefully from all sides and wrote observations on the card. From the attention paid to birthmarks and the detailed inspection of his face, Innocenty concluded he was looking for identification marks. The purple-nosed warder left in his turn. Innocenty sat naked and apathetic. The door rattled again. A stout, dark-haired lady in a snow-white linen coat came in. She had a coarse, arrogant face and an educated manner. Coming to, Innocenty dived for his underpants to cover his nakedness, but the woman gave him a scornful, altogether unfeminine glance, and thrusting out her already prominent lower lip said, "Have you got lice?" Still holding his pants draped in front of him, Innocenty looked firmly into her dark Armenian eyes and said, "I'm a diplomat." "So what? Have you any complaints?" "Why am I under arrest? Can I see the warrant? Can I see the prosecutor?" he said. "That's not what I asked you," she said. "No venereal disease." "What?" "Have you never had gonorrhea, syphilis, soft cankers, leprosy, tuberculosis?" She left the room without waiting for his answer. The very first of the warders he had seen, the one with the long face, now came in. As he neither harmed nor insulted him, Innocenty felt he was almost a friend. "Why are you still undressed?" he said severely. "Get dressed." Well, this was easier said than done. Locked up by himself, Innocenti struggled with his trousers, trying to make them keep up without braces and hardly any buttons. Lacking the experience of generations of prisoners, he nevertheless solved the problem for himself, as had millions of his predecessors. He guessed where the bits of strings came from. All he had to do was tie his trousers at the waist and flap with his shoelaces. Noticing for the first time that the metal tips had been torn off, he wondered why this had been done. Presumably the Lubyanka regulations assumed that prisoners could use them for making saws to cut through their bars. The tunic had no buttons either, but that couldn't be helped. Having checked through the peephole that the prisoner was now dressed, the sergeant unlocked the door, ordered him to keep his hands behind his back, and led him to still another room where the warder with the purple nose waited for him. "Take your shoes off," he greeted Innocenti. There was a doctor's measuring scale against one of the walls. Purple Nose stood Innocenti with his back to it, measuring his height, noted it on the card, and said, "You can put your shoes on." "Hands behind your back," added Longface from the door, although from here to box number 8 was only 2 steps across the passage. And once again, Innocenti was locked in the box. The mysterious machine still hummed intermittently. Holding his overcoat, he sank listlessly onto the stool. All he had seen from the first moment he had found himself in the Lubyanka were dazzling lights, walls oppressively close to him, and silent, blank-faced warders. Each procedure, more senseless than the last, struck him as a deliberate insult. He failed to see them as links in a considered logical chain of events. Preliminary search by the agents who'd made the arrest. Establishment of the prisoner's identity. His admission, in absentia at the office, against a receipt from the prison administration. Thorough search on admission. First hygienic precautions. Listing of identification marks. Medical examination. The procedure had lulled him, deprived him of his common sense and the will to resist. His one longing was to sleep. He assumed now he'd be left alone for a while. His viewpoint altered by his 3-hour stay in the Lubyanka, and seeing no other practical way to achieve his end, he stood the stool on the table, spread his fine cloth overcoat with its grey lambskin collar on the floor, and lay down. His back was flat. His head he propped up against one corner of the box, and he bent his legs at the knees, resting his feet against the opposite corner. And yet for a few moments before his limbs grew numb, he experienced bliss. He was dozing off when the door flew open with a loud, deliberate noise. "Stand up," said the woman warder. His eyelids fluttered. "Stand up! Stand up!" "But I want to sleep." "Stand up!" the woman shouted, bending over him like a vision of Medusa. Getting up with difficulty from his cramped position, he said, "Can't you take me somewhere I can sleep?" "It's forbidden." The Medusa in sky blue epaulets snapped and locked the door. He leaned against the wall and waited, while she watched him through the door for a long time, raising the shield over the peephole again and again. Finally she went, and he took advantage of her absence to sink back onto the floor. He was almost asleep when the door creaked. A tall, muscular man, who would have done well as a road mender or a stonemason, came in wearing a white coat. "Take your things," he said. Innocenti took his hat and coat and followed him, tottering, his eyes dull, and his feet by now unable to tell whether the floor was smooth or rough. He was in a state of extreme exhaustion, with no strength left to move, ready to lie down there, and then in the middle of the corridor. They went through a narrow opening in a thick wall to another corridor, not as clean as the first. There the man unlocked a door to a cabin. It was very like the dressing room of a Russian bath. Gave him a piece of kitchen soap no bigger than a matchbox and ordered him to wash. For a long time Innocenti couldn't bring himself to do it. He was used to the shining cleanliness of tiled bathrooms, and although the cabin, with its plank walls and wooden benches, would have struck the average person as perfectly clean, to him it seemed filthy. At last he found a sufficiently dry patch in one of the benches to undress, and leaving his clothes, picked his way gingerly over the damp slats marked with the prints of both bare feet and shoes. He would much have preferred not to wash or undress at all, but the stonemason had unlocked the dressing room door and ordered him to take a shower. The shower room door was not like an ordinary, not a prison door, with 2 glass panels, except the glass panes were missing. Beyond it were more wooden slats, which seemed dirty to Innocenti, and 4 showers running with beautifully hot and cold water. But this he failed to appreciate. 4 showers at the disposal of one man. This gave him no pleasure. Had he known that in the world of prisoners it was more usual for 4 men to wash under one shower, he might have attached more value to a 16-fold privilege. While still in the dressing room, he had flung away the harsh and evil-smelling soap in disgust. Never in all his 30 years of life had he held such a thing in his hands, or even known about its existence. And now he splashed himself for a couple of minutes, chiefly to wash off the bits of hair which had been pricking him in the tender parts of his body after the haircut. And then, feeling dirtier than before, he went back to the dressing room for his clothes. But there was nothing on any of the benches. All his splendid, if ruined, clothes had been taken away. Only the galoshes and the shoes inside them stood with their toes pointed under the bench. The outer door was locked and the peephole covered. All Innocenti could do was sit sculpturally naked like Rodin's Thinker, and think. After a time, he was issued with coarse, washed-out prison underclothes, stamped with the words "Detention Centre" on the back and front, and similarly stamped small square of Turkish toweling folded in four, which he did not immediately recognise as a towel. The underclothes had buttons of some material which felt like cardboard, but there were too few of them, and there were tapes, but some of them were missing. The pants were too short and caught him between the legs, and the vest was so big that his hands were lost in the sleeves. His request to change it for another pair was refused, as he had soiled this one by putting it on. Wearing this clumsy set of reach-me-downs, he still had to wait in the dressing room for a time. He was told that his outer clothes were in the fryer. The word was new to him. Even when the country was full of fryers throughout the war, he had never come across one. But if the frying of his clothes was in keeping with his other senseless humiliations, he imagined a gigantic devil's frying pan. He tried to consider his position soberly, to think out what he should do about it, but his thoughts were confused and jumped from one thing to another. The tight underpants, the frying pan with his tunic in it, the constant watchful eye outside the door, now hidden, now uncovered by the shield of the peephole. The shower had woken him up, but he felt utterly weak and exhausted. He wished he could lie on something dry, and not cold, lie motionless until the strength which was draining away from him returned. But he couldn't bring himself to lie half naked on the damp, sharp-edged planks, which didn't even meet in the middle of the bench. The door opened, but not for the arrival of his clothes from the fryer. Standing beside the bath attendant was a pink-cheeked, broad-faced girl in civilian dress, modestly covering up what the inadequacies of his underclothes left exposed. Innocenti went to the door. After ordering him to sign a carbon copy, the girl handed him a receipt from the detention centre of the MGB of the USSR, which, on December the 26th, 1949, had taken for safekeeping for Volodin IA, one fountain pen with yellow metal holder and nib, one tie pin with inset red stone, one pair cufflinks of blue stone. Again he sat and waited, dispirited. At last his clothes were brought. The overcoat cold and undamaged, the tunic, trousers and shirt crumpled, faded and still hot. Couldn't they have taken care of the tunic as well as the coat, said Innocenti. The coat has a fur trimming, use your head, said the bath attendant. After the fryer, even his own clothes felt as though they were someone else's and disgusted him. Wearing all these alien, uncomfortable things, he was taken back to his box, number 8. He asked for water and drank 2 mugs full. It was the same mug with a picture of a cat. Another girl came and gave him, against his signature, a blue receipt from the detention centre of the MGB of the USSR, which on December the 27th, it was already the 27th, had taken from Volodin IA 1 silk vest, 1 pair silk pants, 1 pair braces and a tie. The machine hummed intermittently and mysteriously as before. Locked up once more, Innocenti rested his arms on the table, his head on his arms, and tried to sleep. That's forbidden, said the new warder, opening the door. The woman was off duty. What's forbidden? To rest your head. His thoughts in total confusion, Innocenti continued to wait. They brought him another receipt, this one on white paper, from the detention centre of the MGB of the USSR, which had taken from Volodin IA 123, 123 rubles. Then came a man wearing a blue linen coat over an expensive brown suit. Every time they brought him a receipt, they asked him his surname. And now he was asked again. Surname, name and patronymic, date of birth, place of birth. After which the man said, without. What? Innocenti was taken aback. Without your things, of course. Hands behind your back. In the corridor, all orders were given softly, so they could not be heard inside the boxes. Clicking his tongue at the same invisible dog, the man in the brown suit took Innocenti through the main exit and another corridor to a large room which was not of the prison type. It had curtains on the window, soft furniture and a desk. Innocenti was made to sit on a chair in the middle. He concluded he was about to be questioned. Instead, however, a camera was wheeled in from behind a curtain. 2 strong lights were switched on, and he was photographed full face and in profile. The officer who brought Innocenti took each finger of his right hand and rolled it on a sticky roller covered with printer's ink, so that all 5 fingertips turned black. Spreading them evenly, he pressed them all together against a sheet of paper and tore it off. The left hand was fingerprinted in the same way. Above the fingerprints on the paper, there was a line of writing. Volodin Innocenti Artemyevich, born 1919, Leningrad. And above that was printed in bold characters, to be kept in perpetuity. Innocenti read the official formula and shivered. There was something mystical about it, something transcending. He was allowed to scrub his hands with soap and a nail brush in cold water over a wash basin. The greasy ink was hard to remove by these inadequate means. The cold water ran off it. Innocenti scrubbed his fingertips with the soapy brush and did not question the inverted logic of making him have a bath before fingerprinting. His confused and exhausted mind was wholly in the power of the terrifying formula from another dimension, to be kept in perpetuity.